But our final speaker is Dr. John Briscoe, who will speak to us about the challenge of water management in the developing world and the unfinished agenda for dealing with known variability. Dr. Briscoe is the Gordon McKay Professor of Engineering at Harvard. Many of us, of course, know him over the years in his roles in the World Bank, which included the senior water advisor to the president of the bank. And he was also, in his last job, the person that was in charge of the largest borrower for the bank, that is Brazil. John has led a life in these areas of water and has actually lived what he talks about. He's lived in Bangladesh, Mozambique, South Africa, Brazil, and probably several other countries. And I just want to give a personal comment because John comes from the World Water Community, which is where I come from primarily. We all know him very well, and we owe him a tremendous debt of gratitude for the leadership he has provided in the water policy world in the last 2 decades. All of us have come to disagree with him at certain times, but all of us listen to him, and we're in for a wonderful survey here. But John, you're downstream. We've preserved the time at the releases of the irrigation, and so we'll keep you to it. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, tail enders always just get the drips that are left, but thanks very much, Jerry and others. And I was this morning a little bit alarmed to see one of the presentations talk about the South African jackass, because I am South African, and after such brilliant erudite presentations before, I think I will only qualify further as the jackass of this. But let me try and do some reflection, as Jerry said, of, in a sense, a life of practice on the issues of water, climate change, development, and even venturing into some of the ethical issues. I think if we look at climate change, as we've seen in many of the presentations, and we think about mitigation, mostly mitigation is about energy, some about land use changes we've seen in terms of forests. Adaptation, mostly about water. And I want to talk about both of these sides. Firstly, if we look at the role of water in mitigation, a very important issue that seems somewhat passé in the rich world is that hydropower is a very large source, still a very large untapped source in many areas of low carbon energy. If you look at this picture, for example, you see on the vertical axis is the percentage of potential that has been developed. In Europe and North America, this is around 80%, basically pretty much all developed. If you're in Africa, this is around 3%. All of the developing world has very large amounts of hydroelectric potential still to develop. This is renewable, non-polluting, and generally pretty cheap in those countries. The importance of this is that while it is largely tapped in rich countries, there still is enormous potential in developing countries. This is by far the largest potential source of renewable energy, much bigger than solar and wind in the foreseeable future. And all what I will call the countries with choices, that is basically developing countries that have the intellectual and financial resources to control their own destinies rather than depending on others for that. India, China, Brazil, these countries have major hydropower expansion plans that they are currently undertaking. These have to, however, and this was stressed by General Walsh this morning when he talked to us about the Mississippi, there is very seldom in this business just a hydropower plant. These are almost all large multi-purpose projects, both in a narrow sense and in a much broader sense. So when we look, for example, at Three Gorges, many people say, aha, that's a 20,000 megawatt hydropower plant. In fact, it's primarily a flood control project, which, by the way, produces 20,000 megawatts when there's enough water in it. But it goes beyond that, because when we are dealing with water, as this meeting is testimony to, we have to be aware that water is much more than even just navigation, hydropower, flood protection. When we look, and there's much discussion of the epistemological part of this, but in Chinese, if you look at a river on the left and you look at an embankment and you put those two together, this is, by the way, the full extent of my knowledge of Chinese. The interesting question there is, what does that symbol mean? And that symbol, most of us would think You would think it's water resource management of something of that sort, but no, that actually means political order. So when we're dealing with the multiple purposes of water management, managing water is, yes, about all of these material and practical things, but it's also very much about politics and social order. If we look, I've been working a lot recently in Pakistan. Pakistan's Tarbela Dam on the Indus, a very large dam, does produce a large amount of hydropower, around 3,500 megawatts, but it's primarily, in fact, an irrigation dam, which is really the backbone of the Pakistani economy, the world's biggest contiguous irrigation system that you can see from space very clearly. If you had a picture 200 years ago, that would have been a desert. Today, that's what Pakistan looks like, thanks to these water projects. Now, when we have expansion, as there is taking place, of hydropower in the developing world and everywhere, there come a series of challenges. Again, to focus on a particular issue to illustrate a general point, if you look at the Indus Basin and the Punjab, the 5 rivers that come out of India and into Pakistan, India being in the yellow here and Pakistan in the sort of purple. There's about 6,000 megawatts of hydropower that's being developed in Indian-held Kashmir. And this is actually putting the Indus Water Treaty, done in 1960, about the only thing on which India and Pakistan have managed to agree for the last 60 years, is putting this water treaty under very, very severe stress. So you now see a very interesting piece in a magazine a couple of weeks ago asking whether these bitter nuclear rivals are actually now able to, if this treaty is able to survive going forward. So I think the point is hydropower, very important. As we develop it more, in many places there are going to be challenges. Aaron Wolf, who is there, this is courtesy of Aaron, one of his great pictures of the international river basins in green, and you'll see a large portion of the developing world is covered by international river basins. And this, of course, the clash over the water, hydro, and others in these is the stuff on which people love to write books on water wars, most of which fortunately have not materialized. But there are also other things that happen when people do things together in rivers. Montesquieu liked to talk about two nations who traffic with each other become reciprocally dependent, and their union is found on mutual necessities. So that we have a lot of examples around the world, the Indus, Lesotho Highlands, Mekong, Paraná in South America, the Senegal Basin, in which you find large hydropower projects and other water projects, in fact, becoming mechanisms by which countries develop peaceful relationships. In this particular case, this is Lesotho, President Mandela inaugurating with the Prime Minister of Lesotho a project which further cemented ties between Lesotho and South Africa. A very important case when we look at hydro as being key for climate, for mitigation of greenhouse gases, is the case of poor mountainous countries. There are quite a number of these countries which are small countries which have essentially as their main resource water and gravity that are situated next to very large markets. These are the Nepals, Bhutans, Lesotho, Laos, Uganda countries of the world. An example of this, again from South Asia, Nepal. Nepal and the United States have about the same hydro potential. The United States has developed around 70,000 megawatts of hydropower. Nepal has developed 300. And you have to say, why has this been the case? This has been the case basically because Nepal has relied on institutions like the World Bank, the bilateral development agencies, to say they will help with the financial capital to enable Nepal to develop this one resource. This has basically been, and I'll describe this a little more, an incredibly frustrating journey for these countries, basically because the international community, in my view, has failed these countries and failed us all, because the alternative is that they have to turn to coal and other forms of power. An interesting case right next to Nepal is Bhutan, where, for some of you will know, Bhutan measures not only gross national product, but gross national happiness. And this is much admired, the measurement of this and the Bhutanese dedication to happiness. What is less understood is that much of this is underpinned, in fact, by an enormous expansion of hydropower. In this case, financed by India, built by India, purchased by India, with India controlling these whole deals. And this is basically what a country like Nepal has to do if it wants to advance. Who will help build this infrastructure in poor countries? Traditional donors such as the World Bank, but this goes for all the bilaterals and all the international financial institutions, have been subject to enormous pressure, much of it deserved, from the NGO and environmental community, who generally don't like anything less than they like big dams. They don't like big dams at all. For the middle-income countries like Brazil's and India's and China's, they've basically said, thanks very much, we'll build them anyway, this is our business. But for poor countries, in this case Uganda, they cannot move on their own. They do not have the resources to do that. So you see here an example of a small to medium-sized hydropower project in Uganda. President Museveni saying things like, I'm ashamed to even come here. I'm not happy because a project that should have taken 2 years has taken 7 years to start. This was actually 7 years ago, and the project still hasn't started, so that was 14 years. All this hullabaloo has been a waste of time and a lack of seriousness. This was a circus. This is a very common feeling in the developing world about the inability of the developed world to help them on these serious issues. Just one illustration of this is what happened to World Bank lending for hydropower from around $1 billion a year until it basically disappeared in the late 1990s. Into all of this, these countries sit with enormous resources, enormous possibilities, very important for the development, and they feel failed by the international community. So what has happened now, to the consternation of many people, not myself I should add, is that the middle-income countries have accumulated large amounts of reserves, as you all know. The Chinese have $1,000 billion in foreign exchange reserves, and they are now going in and filling this gap. So if you look at the World Bank financing something like 2 or 3 hydropower projects in the developing world, the Chinese are financing over 200 right now. So basically the financier of choice in the developing world has become China, followed now by Brazil and India and others getting in. In all of this, the future of carbon financing and hydropower, carbon market is now around $90 billion a year. It's large. Hydropower can only take advantage of the resources of the clean development mechanism when they have power densities that are greater than 10 watts per square meter. And what does that mean? If you look, are these criteria reasonable? This graph, you don't have to worry for the moment on the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis here are hectares submerged per megawatt. So here basically, if you have a very, very large hydropower plant, you may have seen this in Brazil, the infamous Balbina project, a very large submerged area for relatively small amount of power, you will be towards the right-hand side of this, large amount submerged per, so you have a couple of projects there. In those areas, there's a risk that greenhouse gas emissions may in fact exceed thermal GHG emissions when you're in a heavily vegetated tropical sites. Now, the conditions put on by the clean development mechanism will only allow not around 1,000 hectares per megawatt, but around 10, so 2 orders of magnitude less. What this has done is, and you can see here, it's basically taken most of the hydropower projects that are viable in the developed world and say these are not eligible for carbon credits. As we move towards Copenhagen, there's of course a lot of discussion about what will be included in clean development mechanisms. This is, I never knew there was a term, there's something called a non-paper, which apparently makes it much more important than a paper. And if it's secret, it's even more important, and this I think was secret too. But if you look at that, it says in that paper, this is of last week, nationally appropriate mitigation actions shall not include technologies that have adverse impacts on the environment. And they're including nuclear and large-scale hydropower. So even though these may have absolutely no impact on greenhouse gases, for something on climate change, which I understood to be concerned with the emission of gases, these are excluded on other grounds. Now, this is something which is of great concern to the developing world. Basically, how they see it is, you've done yours, we are going to want to do ours, and you're essentially saying we can't do it. And this is a part of the mistrust that underlies this whole thing, that Copenhagen and these conventions are really for the rich people not to allow poor countries to develop, and I have some sympathy with that. So this is on the mitigation side. On the adaptation side, many developing countries already have high climatic variability. Some very interesting work done by colleagues at Columbia University, and we'll pass this out afterwards. It's a bit dense to get it, but there's no simpler way of doing it. If you look in this graph, on the right hand, on the x-axis is mean annual rainfall, on the vertical axis is monthly rainfall variability. The bubble size here is GDP per capita. So big bubbles mean rich countries. And the blue ones are places that have low interannual variability. So from year to year, relatively little change. The purplish ones are ones where you have high change. If you take out the top left, which are the Gulf countries, you see that wealthy nations share a relatively small window of favorable climate. This is low variability both between years and within years, and moderate rainfall. Very high rainfall is as bad for countries as very little rainfall is. Now, what this means is developing countries are mostly out of this. They face high variability, often droughts, often floods. This means that you find even in relatively developed middle-income countries, the Indian Minister of Finance talking that every budget he does is a gamble on the monsoon. They're still terribly dependent on what happens there. Climate change, and we've seen many of these graphs, of course, ups this ante. This morning, Gavin Schmidt talked to us a little bit about saying, quoting Niels Bohr, on prediction is difficult, particularly about the future, and it's even difficult about the past. And I think here we have to be really very modest, as I think Gavin pointed out this morning, in being very sure that we know about where we're going on this. He talked about the Colorado case, which is a fascinating case. This is, if you look here at, this is since the 1900 in the black on the end here, where we actually have flow records for the Colorado River. We sit at the end of that period and we say there's an unprecedented drought, this is climate change. But in the Colorado, they've actually been able to reconstruct through tree rings the record back as far as 1550, over basically 500 years. And what you see here is that, in fact, it is not unprecedented at all. What was unprecedented, actually, is that the early years when we measured were relatively wet by historic record, not that the current period is particularly dry. And there are a whole series of periods over the last 500 years in which we've had this. So we have to be, I think, quite cautious about assumptions that every drought is climate change having come. But there are places where this is obviously going to be hugely important. Going back to South Asia, the Himalayas, we see the Himalaya glaciers retreating, as we saw today, several showing this. And this is going to have, in some places, this is in the upper reaches of the Indus River, and here are under different temperature assumptions, you see for something like 3 or 4 decades, some increased flow in the Indus as the glaciers melt, but then very, very large reductions probably within this century in the Indus flow. So the Himalayas retreating is a big deal, a very big deal for the Indus. But it's important to point out that everything is location specific. For the Ganges, if you look similarly at Allahabad down in the plains, you can basically, these are the same model, you can basically see no impact. And that's basically because the Ganges is completely dominated by rainfall, not by snowmelt. So the Indus, as you see here, almost half of its flow due to snowmelt, glacial melt into the river flow. The other rivers coming off, the Yangtze around 20%, many of the others, it's rainfall that dominates. So we will see changes and we will see droughts and we will see floods for sure. Finally, what are some of, in a rather mundane way, some of the adaptive responses? The first is infrastructure. And here, again, a picture of the very, very stark divide that we live in the world. If you look at us sitting in the United States, for every citizen of the United States, there's enough storage to hold around 6,000 cubic meters for every one of us. If you go to Ethiopia, that number's 40, so 1/200th of what the United States have. This means, if you look here, the yellow line here is the percentage of GDP change per year over the last 20 years. The blue line is the rainfall. Basically, if it rains in Ethiopia, it does okay. If it doesn't rain, they have absolutely no protection. They have no infrastructure with which to buffer them from the effects of climate, either droughts or floods. If you look at what happens when countries put these in place, the large infrastructure built in northeast India changed the amount of seasonal labor. The yellow is before, in which there was a bit of labor, nothing, a bit again, nothing, into much more consistent patterns. And you see there very large increases in the well-being strangely enough, particularly of labor, because you get much more productive areas, you get much more labor, and in fact the landless do very, very well when these happen. And this is why Mr. Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, talked about these as the temples of modern India. These remain very, very important for people in the developing world. Let me pass over this. This picture was done when at the World Bank we were doing our new water strategy, and it was presented by our Chinese colleagues. And I think it's profoundly important. Very simple, and what it suggests is that if you look at the returns of investment, when countries do not have infrastructure, if you tell Ethiopia or Kenya to manage their floods and droughts, they simply can't do it because they have no instruments with which to manage it. So the returns on management there are quite low. The returns on infrastructure are very high in the early periods. And then this switches. If you get to the United States today, in which there's an enormous amount of infrastructure, it's mostly a management job. But it's the great danger here is being on the right-hand side of the graph and projecting back to people on the left-hand side to say they should be doing what we are doing. The second issue is institutions. So countries need infrastructure, and the developing world needs a lot of infrastructure still to be built. This morning, Graham Kelleher, is Graham here still? Yeah. Well, Mr. Rudd is here, okay. So I talked about the Murray-Darling Basin. What can you do with robust adaptive instruments? And I'll be finishing in a couple of minutes, Jerry. The Murray-Darling Basin, as Graham said this morning, 70% reduction in flows and water delivered over the last 10 years. If you look at this graph, this tells you what the value for each cubic meter of water, if you're using it on the right-hand side for rice, the left-hand side for vegetables. There's some things in which you get a lot out of a little water and others in which you get very little from it. Australia has a system in which water is mobile, in which there are property rights in water, and basically what's happened is that they've moved out of the crops on the right-hand side into those on the left. And the really remarkable results of this, you see the amount of water traded has increased very much. The trading price has increased a lot, so that somebody who had a lot of water and was growing paddy, they can in fact make much more money by selling their water to somebody who's growing grapes or almonds. The end result of this is a really extraordinary figure in my view, and that's you've had this enormous climate change happen to the Southeast Australia, 70% reduction in stream flow, but there has basically been very little reduction in agricultural output and very little reduction in agricultural employment. This is not to say the situation's pretty, this is incredibly difficult environmentally, but they show what good institutions can do. Lastly, technological innovation. If we are going to deal with adaptation, we have had the Green Revolution has basically kept this all at bay for the last 30 years, and that is all running out of steam. We need new types of crops. If you look again at the international community, what they've done in the last 30 years, from 1980 here, you see in 1980 about 17% of development assistance was into agriculture, partially as a result of pressure from environmental groups. That's been reduced very dramatically to the point where, come 2005, it was down at 4%. So basically the developed world has left the developing world without inputs into agriculture. If you look at the few countries who have done well, as Jerry said, I lived in Brazil the last 3 years. Brazil has quite defied that. They've invested a lot in agricultural research, and they have over the last 30 years, they have quadrupled the amount of agricultural product they produce, with 90% of that coming from greater productivity out of the existing resources they have. This is not cutting down the Amazon. This is using relatively small increases in labor, capital, and land, and massive amounts of information and intelligence applied to it. This has made Brazil an agricultural superpower. This issue of genetically modified organisms is hugely important. Europeans, I know in particular, don't like this. This is Frankenstein foods. These are ones which enable you to grow crops, much more crop per unit of water, much more crop per unit of fertilizer and pesticides. This has been, means that countries, again, which depend on the beneficence of Europe, and Europe in particular in this case, like Africa, have not been able to use GMOs. The middle-income countries have basically said we are going ahead anyway, and you have 8 of the 10 of the largest GMO users being the major middle-income countries. The second part here on water and wastewater technology, we now find things like reverse osmosis, an enormous amount of investment going into being able to clean up water and wastewater more cheaply. It is potentially feasible that we do desalination at a quarter of the cost that we do now. If it's even only half the cost, if it's 50 cents a cubic meter rather than $1 a cubic meter, this completely changes the situation in most coastal areas of the world. And lastly, information management. We now find large areas of the world in which agriculture is being done on a much more precision basis, with much more careful attention to water, pesticides, fertilizer being applied just when needed, with extensive use of information, sensometers in the soil, drip irrigation, etc. And we now see the prospect of new forms of measurement from basically from ground truth but satellite-based systems in which you can actually manage water abstractions not by going and putting a meter on a pump, but actually by measuring evapotranspiration from the air. For all of these, the private sector is getting into this in a big way, which I think is terrific news. There's enormous business opportunities, and they are making a lot of information, but this requires a partnership with the public sector. So in conclusion then, water, in my view, is at the heart of dealing with climate change, in developing world on mitigation, for all of us on adaptation. For the developing world, the middle-income countries have choices and are going to use all the tools that are available for both mitigation and adaptation. The poor countries, the not middle-income countries, depend on the rules of the game and the goodwill of the rich world. There are, in my view, great moral hazard in rich people telling poor people how they should live their lives and the choices they should make. I think it's wonderful that the great religions are showing concern for the environment, and in my view, in gratuitous advice, the great religions can and should, in my view, play an important role in ensuring that when these discussions are held, that the voice and legitimate concerns of poor countries are heard equally strongly. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doug. Once again, thank you to the panelists for the time.